Greetings and welcome to the pre-concert video for the second in our series of concerts featuring Robert Schumann and his contemporaries, those who inspired him, or those whom he inspired in turn. Now this will be the second of three of these concerts. The third one will be at the beginning of February 2022 when we perform Schumann's virtuosic Symphony No. 2. Now each of these concerts will also include a work by a major Canadian composer as well. And in this case, it's the third symphony of one of Quebec's most celebrated composers, Jacques Hétu. Now, there's always lots to say about more recently composed music, so if you'll indulge me, I'm going to take a bit of a long detour here from Schumann and talk about Jacques Hétu and his music. Now, he was born in Trois-Rivières in 1938. He died not too long ago in 2010. The Victoria Symphony has performed a number of his pieces throughout the decades. He is particularly noted for writing concertos for a number of prominent Canadian soloists. And we've performed his clarinet concerto with its commissioner, who is James Campbell. He also wrote for the pianists André Laplante and Robert Silverman, and one of his final pieces was a trombone concerto for Alain Trudel, who was our principal guest conductor for a number of years. Now, we have performed Jacques Hétu's Third Symphony twice before, once with our own former music director, Kees Bockels, and this was back just before he was appointed our principal guest conductor. This would have been the early 1990s. We've also performed it with a champion of Canadian music, the conductor Rafi Armenian, back in 2000. Now, Jacques Hétu was definitely a product of the mid-20th century. He studied with all the major teachers in his native Quebec, and like so many Canadians, he studied abroad as well. In his case, he worked with two French composers, Henri Dutilleux and Olivier Messiaen. One of the hallmarks of his compositions, and so this is your theory lesson for the day, and then this is the use of what we call octatonic scales. I want to talk about this because I think it might demystify a lot of music for you, especially a lot of contemporary music that we play, and especially this particular piece, which was written in 1971. Really quickly, okay, a scale, remember I've talked about scales a lot. A scale is any number of patterns that fill the space between octaves. Now, an octave, if you remember, I've talked about this a lot on these talks. If you go back and look up my old videos, an octave is simply the result of doubling the frequency of a note. So here's what an octave sounds like. I'll show you an image here of two notes. They're both the same note. They're both A's. They're an octave apart. The higher one is double the frequency of the other. So the top note in this example will vibrate your eardrum 440 times each second. By the way, that's the note we tune to in a symphony orchestra. So there's a new trivia fact for you. The lower one vibrates at 220 cycles per second. So the way our brains process sound, both of these sound very similar to our ears, even though one's obviously higher than the other. Now we call this an octave, but it's really a bit of a misnomer. We only call it that because most scales in our European way of thinking fill that gap with 7 intervals. The octave being the 8th note, octo, 8, remember octopus, octagon. This is just a repeat of the first note. So the most common scale, of course, you all know this one, I've demonstrated it a lot, the Do-Re-Mi scale from The Sound of Music. This is the major scale. This is the scale on which so much music in the European tradition is built. Now you'll notice one thing about this particular image. I am labeling the spaces between the notes of this scale as whole tones or semitones. Now the semitone is the smallest interval in our European system. If we divided that octave into semitones, we would have 12 of them. In fact, this is another type of scale, and it's called a chromatic scale. And if you know your Greek, that comes from the word for color, chroma, because this scale literally has all the colors. It uses all the crayons in the box, so to speak. So let's go back to the major scale for a second. You can see how spacing the whole tones, which have 2 semitones in each of them, and the semitones in this way give the scale its characteristic sound. Now, I've mentioned a lot in these talks that the 2 most important notes in a major scale are the first note and the 5th note, and I've labeled them in this image. We call them the tonic and the dominant. If you start the scale on either of these notes, that semitone falls in the same place. Do, re, mi, fa, there's the semitone there. And if I start on the dominant, sol, la, ti, do, there's the semitone again at the end. So that's one of the things that gives this scale its architecture, so to speak. So what's an octatonic scale then? Well, as you would guess, because of the octo prefix, it has 1 extra note. It has 8 notes. Most scales only have 7. The octatonic has 8. So it's arranged with the whole tones and the semitones arranged symmetrically, so they're spaced evenly. So every whole tone alternates with a semitone, and it sounds like this. So what's the effect of arranging the tones and semitones this way? Well, for starters, this scale doesn't have that strong relationship between the tonic and the dominant, the 1st and the 5th scale notes. In fact, there is no dominant in this scale at all. The 5th note forms that interval which I've talked about a lot, the tritone, that dissonant, that they sometimes call it the devil's interval. So when you're writing a melody line using this scale, the effect is much, much freer. You still have the ability to write a very expressive line, but you're not bound by the limitations of other scales. And to demonstrate what I mean, here's a bit of the opening of Jacques Hétu's 3rd Symphony, which you're going to hear. You'll even hear that tritone in there as a very prominent interval. So that gives the music a very mysterious and at times a mystical quality. So that was a really quick 1,000-word theory lesson for you. Now back to Schumann's circle, and I'm just going to talk briefly about the rest of the music on this program. This concert features the Mendelssohn siblings. That would be a great TV show, wouldn't it? The Mendelssohn siblings. Felix Mendelssohn and his sister, Fanny Mendelssohn. Felix, of course, is no stranger to any of you. We just presented a virtual concert of his Symphony No. 5 and his Overture to St. Paul just quite recently, only a few weeks before this. His 3rd and 4th symphonies, known respectively as the Scottish and Italian symphonies, are 2 of the most performed works in our Victoria Symphony repertoire. And of course, on this program, we're performing the Italian Symphony, the 4th. Mendelssohn was an early influence on Robert Schumann. It was said that the music of Beethoven, Schubert, and Mendelssohn in particular were perhaps Schumann's earliest musical influences. In 1835, Schumann finally met Felix Mendelssohn. This was in the same year he began his relationship with his piano teacher's daughter, Clara Wieck, who married him 5 years later. You'll remember that from my last pre-concert video. It was also the same year that Mendelssohn wrote a very popular set of piano pieces. They were all based on various themes around Carnival, you know, the period just before Lent. We sometimes call it Mardi Gras. In the 20th century, some of these piano pieces were orchestrated by the great French composer and the brilliant orchestrator Maurice Ravel. Now, Ravel, as you know, went down in orchestration history, of course, with his setting of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. Now, Carnival is one of our features on this particular program of Robert Schumann. We're performing this alongside another orchestration, and that is of Johannes Brahms, and it's of his popular Liebesliederwalzer, which means love song waltzes. These were written, of course, for voices and an accompaniment of two people playing at one piano. We call that a piano four hands accompaniment for short. This is a purely orchestral arrangement of this. So this is for orchestra, no piano, no voices. And it will give you the melodies, of course. You'll lose the text because there are no singers, but you get to hear Brahms's beautiful melodic gift in these orchestrations. Incidentally, Brahms's love for the waltz is shown in this image. This is Brahms and the undisputed king of the waltz. This is Johann Strauss Jr., and he's the composer of the famous Blue Danube Waltz and the hundreds and hundreds of other waltzes that we feature on our New Year's Day concerts. You'll notice on the bottom of this photograph, there's a little fragment of the Blue Danube Waltz, the famous da-da-da-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. Now, there's a story that Strauss's wife asked Brahms for his autograph once. She asked him to autograph a fan. Perhaps it was on the occasion of this photograph being taken, I don't know. But Brahms wrote that little fragment on her fan, and he signed underneath it, Leider nicht von Brahms, which means unfortunately, or alas, not by Johannes Brahms. So there was an awful lot of admiration for the waltz composer by Johannes Brahms. Now, the final work that you're going to hear on this concert is by Mendelssohn's sister Fanny Mendelssohn, and this is an overture in C major. Now, like Clara Schumann, Fanny Mendelssohn composed mainly smaller scale pieces and didn't leave us much in the way of orchestral music. So, just like the Clara Schumann piano concerto last time, this is also a Victoria's Symphony premiere. In fact, in just this calendar year, we have performed 3 female 19th century composers for the very, very first time: Clara Schumann, Fanny Mendelssohn, and Louise Fahrenk. Now, Fanny Mendelssohn is unfortunately, like so many women in the arts throughout history, underrepresented, and really a testimonial to just how much women's voices were silenced throughout history. For example, Mendelssohn's own father wrote to her that music will perhaps become his, that is, her brother Felix's, profession, while for you it can and must be only an ornament. So what a terrible thing for a father to say to his daughter. Thankfully, she wrote a lot of other music that we can enjoy. She wrote a lot of, again, like Clara Schumann, smaller scale music. And I think you'll find this overture particularly delightful and a particularly good example of what I would call a very underrepresented composer. So that's it for this, another very eclectic and varied program. Thanks very much for watching.